Hello and welcome to the podcast from the Huffines Institute for Sports Medicine and Human Performance. I'm your host, Dr. Tim Lightfoot, and I want to thank you for being with us today because this is a very special occasion for us. 10 years ago today, we published our first podcast. Yep, 278 podcasts later, we're still here. We're still rocking and rolling, and we've got a special treat for you today. We're going to rerun that first podcast. I would ask you to excuse some of the technical and the audio glitches. Certainly we do a lot better nowadays, but the content and the information is still great. Our podcast guest is a longtime podcast guest for us, has been with us at least 4 times, Dr. Jim Fluckey. He's a great teacher, a great physiologist, and a lot of the things he said in that podcast, most of the things are still very true about the science going on in the art of muscle development. And so I'd encourage you to listen to the podcast. Again, because they were audio only, we just got some still pictures that we've put in there for you. So if you want something to watch, you've got something to watch. But again, it's the audio part that's the most important part. I would be remiss if I didn't take this occasion to thank all the people behind the scenes that have worked on this podcast, from the first producer that we had, Justin Dobson, to the voiceover work that was done by John Miles, to our current executive producer, Lauren Hawkins, and all the people in between that have worked on this podcast. The post-production work after we record it is often the most difficult part of this, and those folks, by far and away, are the ones that have made this successful. A measure of success for any kind of podcast is the number of listeners, the geographic area it covers. And I have to say that on an average year, we average between 30 and 50,000 listeners a year, and about 145 countries. And so that's quite an impact for an academic type of podcast. And again, that's thanks to you, the listening audience. That's thanks to our production staff here that gets us all going. And I have to say, this has also been a model for other podcasts here at the university that have been started, including a new one that we're going to spin off before long from the Texas A&M Coaching Academy, which I would encourage you to listen to. As a matter of fact, we've got a podcast coming up on that really shortly, so I would encourage you to keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy listening to the first podcast again. It's great information. It's been great to have you with us for 10 years. During this time of pandemic, as we've always done, we wanted to remind you that you can exercise and you can exercise safely. Just check out the box here at the bottom that gives you the links to the most up-to-date information about exercising during the pandemic. And as always, we ask you to be active, stay healthy, and again, remember, be safe during this time and stay safe. Again, thank you for all those staff and all the listeners over the years. And until the next podcast, we'll see you then.
From the beautiful campus of Texas A&M University, the Sidney and J.L. Huffines Institute for Sports Medicine and Human Performance in the Department of Health and Kinesiology brings you the Sports Medicine Podcast. Our mission is to make sense of and connect the science, practice, and application of the latest findings in sports medicine and human performance to the real world. Here's our host, the director of the Huffines Institute, Dr. Tim Lightfoot.
All right, welcome to the Huffines Sports Medicine Podcast. We're so glad that you decided to take time today to join us. We are thrilled to be doing this podcast and bringing you the wide world that is sports medicine and all the different varieties that come with that. Today, we're really pleased to have Dr. Jim Fluckey here with us. He's an associate professor here in the Department of Health and Kinesiology at Texas A&M University. And Dr. Fluckey, even though he was raised in New Mexico, he got his Ph.D. from Penn State, and we're glad he came back this direction. And so he's going to visit with us today and talk a little bit about his research and the real-world applications of that. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing in the lab. What are you interested in? I understand it's like something like protein synthesis.
Yes, we've been accused of doing some protein synthesis by at least most people in the field. Yeah, we're very interested in what makes muscle grow. Cool. And how to maintain that muscle growth or maintain that mass under a variety of conditions. We research the effect of disease states, for example, diabetes on muscle protein synthesis and muscle mass. We're also interested in understanding the effects of microgravity on muscle protein mass and synthesis. So
So can most people grow muscles? I mean, if I, like me, who've been in the weight room for years and hasn't put on a pound, if I wanted to grow more muscle, could I? Or is everybody not able to? Or
yeah, I think for the most part, your ability to grow muscle will persist throughout your lifespan. Now, your ability to maintain that muscle is a different story. Anytime we start talking about muscle mass, we have to take into consideration that not only are we growing muscle to maintain that mass, but some of that muscle is disappearing. It's going away. It's being degraded. And when
I'm losing it? Jeez.
You're losing it and gaining it all at the same time. If you haven't changed in your total mass over the years, it's probably because the rate that you're making new protein is equivalent to the rate that you're losing protein or degrading that protein. So you maintain mass.
Okay.
For example, if we have an instance like microgravity or we go into space, we begin to lose muscle mass. And the reason we lose that muscle mass is because the amount of new proteins being synthesized is less than the amount of proteins that are being degraded.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that degradation went up. It could mean that synthesis went down. But there are instances where you might see an increase in degradation with some disease states that would lead to diminished muscle mass over a period of time.
So it's a real balance of losing it and gaining it.
It is.
What you're saying,
It's a real balance, and we're interested in how to maintain that balance. Most of our studies target the synthesis side because, quite frankly, degradation side's a little more difficult and problematic to systematically assess. And we've gotten pretty good at measuring synthesis and factors that lead to increased synthesis. And therefore, that's what we kind of focus on.
So all these, so what this makes me think of is all these advertisements I see for building muscle and protein supplementation and all the different places that sell this stuff. So you actually now have a way that you can actually measure that protein synthesis that supposedly is occurring with some of these supplements or whatever, and to find out if these people are telling the truth about what their supplements will do.
That's true. That may not be the ultimate strategy of our particular our laboratory, but it certainly does provide us with a means to study the effectiveness of some aid, like an amino acid supplement or some kind of pharmacological agent that would allow us to stimulate muscle growth. We could basically test the efficacy of that particular drug or treatment. There's a lot of interest out there now about timing of nutrient intake and whether you should take a supplement pre and post exercise or during exercise. And I think now we have the means to really establish whether or not, in a free living state with this new methodology, whether or not those particular interventions actually, at the end of the day, work.
So Jim, does this mean with this methodology you have now, it seems like it's perfected, that you can start to look at some of these training strategies that I hear about, like as soon as I finish working out, I should be eating protein to help build my muscle, or I guess I should ask, is that even true? I mean, I hear so many different things around that.
I guess the bottom line is we are absolutely convinced that if you add an amino acid to the cellular environment, we can increase muscle protein synthesis with our measures. We're convinced of this.
Right.
Now, whether that applies to a fed state, free living world where eating an amino acid or ingesting an amino acid at a specific time would actually enhance, at the end of the day, your ability to make new protein, I think that's still a little bit controversial. I'm not sure that in our lab, or in our hands anyway, that the timing of protein ingestion outweighs just having nutrient available during the course of the day.
So it doesn't matter when you take the protein as much as you just eat.
In our hands, as long as you have adequate nutrient supply, timing seems to be a bit irrelevant.
Okay. You're being a good scientist here. You're being very careful about what you say. Does anybody really know Or is this still open to debate and experimentation? And I guess if it's the latter answer, if it's still open for debate, then what we're told on TV or told in ads or told in the local nutrition store, they don't know any better than anybody else because the scientists who are actively looking at this don't know.
Well, I think the scientists think they know.
Oh, okay.
Based on their methodologies that they employed. No one's out there telling us a wrong story.
Right.
Basically, they're telling us a story that is very specific to the methodology they employed to research that story.
Which is not necessarily the real world.
Which in most cases is not in the real world. So when I tell you that exercise will increase muscle protein synthesis, we know that. We've known that from any variety of methodologies. But when we start talking about the specific timing of a nutrient intake versus are you adequately nourished, I think those results are going to need further investigation.
Well, let's move away from that a little bit. Let's talk. You're obviously an expert on muscle and building muscle, and so if I've been working out for, let's say, I don't know, 3 years, and I decide to take a couple of weeks off, am I going to lose muscle in that 2 weeks that I've taken off?
Well, if you do, you're not a healthy individual. How's that?
Okay. So, yeah.
I mean, there's always a possibility that somebody could lose muscle from not working out. But the bottom line is, muscles. I've been describing muscle as a very dynamic tissue. With that where we can perturb synthesis and we can perturb degradation and we can affect overall muscle mass. But in a normally healthy individual who's been training for the last few years, a two week hiatus or sabbatical away from the resistance exercise room probably is not going to hurt you at all with regard to muscle mass. And one would argue that if you're maybe overtraining over that 3-year period, that 2-week vacation from weightlifting may actually bring you back faster or bigger, faster, stronger, so to speak. Muscle is, of all the systems that we talk about in exercise physiology, muscle is the one that seems to be the most persistent.
Pretty robust then, right?
It's pretty robust. You don't have, huge changes in muscle mass unless you introduce the individual to, a disease state or complete disuse.
Right.
Like putting somebody in a cast or putting them in a microgravity environment. Generally,
or if they go into bed rest, let's say they get sick and they're in a hospital. Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, 10 days of bed rest has a significant impact on the amount of muscle mass that you have.
Really.
And it's led, those types of studies have led to the impetus behind physicians forcing their subjects to get out or patients to get out of bed. It's a necessary evil. I remember back when I was a little boy, bed rest was almost a prescribed, treatment.
Right, for heart attacks and everything else.
For just about anything, just stay in bed.
Yeah.
But the effect on muscle mass is devastating in that period of time, And we did a study program project at the University of Arkansas for medical sciences that when in our research to develop this program project, we found that the average bed rest stay that occurs when somebody's hospitalized is about 10 days. So we did a study over that 10-day period and found that the effects on muscle mass, even in very frail elderly, where you wouldn't expect to see a lot of loss in muscle mass, was pretty devastating.
Wow.
They would still lose muscle mass.
How about how much, if you had to quantify it? Any kind of percentages or anything like that?
No. I would hate to qualify that off the top of my head. I haven't seen the final outcomes of those data,
but it's devastating. You lose muscle.
You do lose muscle mass.
Now, I've heard that, I don't know if it's a myth or not, that I've heard that the strength anyway is fairly easy to maintain. Just by getting in the weight room once a week, I can maintain my strength.
Sure. Muscle strength seems to be, again, all these muscle parameters. It seems to be any parameter, physical conditioning parameter, unlike aerobic activity or whatever. Muscle seems to be the most robust of the systems. 1 day a week, moderate lifting, you can maintain your strength. And a lot of that's because you maintain your mass. There is a very nice association between the amount of muscle mass that you have and the amount of strength that you can develop. So it falls hand in hand. If we can maintain our muscle size, the strength associated with that muscle size is relatively easy to maintain. If you want to get bigger and stronger, you're going to have to commit more effort to your weightlifting or your force overload. But generally speaking, it's a pretty easy tissue to keep intact.
We've kind of been implying and talking about maybe younger folks who are trying to build muscle and so forth. Does this apply to older folks? I mean, you talked about frail elderly. Is there a point at which you can't gain strength back?
I've had the luxury or privilege of working with Bill Evans' group when he was at the University of Arkansas for Medical Sciences. And back in the day, he did a really nice series of studies with Fiataroni and Hughes and some other collaborators in the Boston area. But the bottom line was they even studied people in their 90s and came to the conclusion that not only can people in their 90s develop strength as a result of their exercise training regimen, but they can actually grow. And surprisingly, they can grow as well as the young whippersnapper 22-year-old, 25-year-old kid.
So you're seeing 80 and 90-year-old individuals.
Yeah. So
now, they weren't putting them on the bench press and having them bench press a ton of weight.
Well, it's all relative. Bottom line is, and in fact, there's a lot of eyebrows raised when we start talking about, taking somebody, of advanced age into the weight room and let them weight lift because we're worried about how much weight they can lift and, gee, can they really work at 60% of their max VO2 and what happens to their blood pressure? And when you start analyzing all the parameters and looking at changes in acute blood pressure and, all of the other things that can go wrong as a result of weightlifting, we find out that if you're capable of 100%, whatever that 100% might be, doing a 60% of your max one repetition or one repetition max is surprisingly, 60% for a 90-year-old is 60% for a 25-year-old.
Interesting.
And so it doesn't seem as though, and in fact, I think we're seeing an emergence of the use of the weight room for just about all ages now because of, in large part to those earlier studies that were featured on 2020 in prime time, and they did a Nova series on them. But bottom line is, not only is the muscle robust, but it seems to be persistently robust throughout your lifespan, which is a very nice thing to know.
So there really is there's no point in your life where you can't gain strength back.
When it comes to muscle strength, I think you're in pretty good shape. Now, there's another element of force production that we call muscle power. Yeah. And one thing that we have noticed with an aging population is that the fibers that are considered the more powerful of the fibers, they shorten at a much greater velocity. Those tend to go away as you grow older. And it may not be so surprising in that the types of fibers that are a little slower in nature are also the ones that we use in day-to-day activities, whereas these faster fibers we only recruit and bring into force production when we are overloading the muscle, so to speak. And so as we grow older and our activity levels change, we tend to recruit those faster fibers more, we recruit them less and less, so to speak. Yeah. And therefore we become more and more reliant on the slower ones, and those faster ones just kind of disappear. So now, I think it's too early to tell, given...
You're being cautious again.
I'm being a little bit cautious. I think it's too early to tell whether or not these fibers go away as a result of aging, or the change in lifestyle.
Interesting.
And I think
because they stop being active.
As our generation stays active throughout their lifespan, we may change our notion on whether these fibers are lost as a result of aging or lifestyle. Because our particular generation, and I'm not trying to date us here, but our particular generation seems to be far more active than the generations preceding us. And therefore, if we can maintain our activity, we may be able to maintain those faster, harder to recruit fibers. and time will tell.
But it seems from what you're saying that there's a real health benefit to either helping the older individuals become stronger or maintaining their activity. It's
sure.
true they can regain some of their activities of daily living, right? If they regain strength.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you start talking about just the force production necessary to get up out of a chair, if that's near 100% of your max effort, obviously any decrement in strength thereafter is going to impair your ability to get out of the chair. So by bringing these individuals into a weight room, for example, and training them, we have an opportunity to not only maintain their strength, but increase their strength, which means that their relative effort of getting out of a chair or walking across a parking lot with a sack of groceries or getting in and out of a car is greatly enhanced. Mm-hmm. They're going to have a real opportunity to maintain that functional lifestyle for a longer period.
So get the older folks in the weight room, and it'll help their healthy lifestyle.
It will help their. Yes, I agree. I'm with you on that one.
Okay.
We're together.
We're together on that one. Well, we're running out of time here, and so I want to thank you, Dr. Fluckey, for coming and taking time today and coming and chatting with us. I think we'll be talking to you in the future as well.
My pleasure.
I thank you all for taking the time to listen to us. Remember, next week you'll have another podcast that's downloaded into your iTunes or whatever other MP3 player that you listen to. And unless there's anything else from our producer, Justin Dobson, we'll say goodbye. We'll see you next week, and we'll turn it over to John for the closing credits.
Thanks for listening to the Huffines Institute Weekly Sports Medicine Podcast. This podcast was produced by Justin Dobson and made possible by generous support from the Omar Smith family and the Sidney and J.L. Huffines family. This podcast is published under a Creative Commons 3.0 license. That means you can't sell it or change it, but feel free to give it to everyone you know and to talk and blog about us. And in case you were wondering, our openings and closing are provided by JohnMilesProductions.com, providing voiceovers internationally. Music was provided by Dave Zeltner. Find him on the web at davidzeltner.com. And just so you know, we love hearing from you. If you have questions or comments, please send them to huffinespodcast@hlkn.tamu.edu. From all of us at the Huffines Institute, we hope you have an active and healthy week.